Hi, and welcome to episode 30 of the DevelopSec podcast. I'm your host, James Jardine, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the HTTP Strict Transport Security, also known as HSTS. If you haven't heard of this, it has been around for a few years. It's been around for a while. And what it is, it's a response header, a setting that comes down in your web application that alerts the browser to let them know that you only want to support HTTPS connections, right? We want to support a secure channel, not HTTP, which would then be transferred in the clear. Somebody along the line could intercept that, they could manipulate it, they could view it, performing your typical man-in-the-middle attacks. So here what we're saying is I'm going to go ahead and tell the browser that anytime you see me put in this domain, whether I put HTTPS in front of it or not, I want you to only use HTTPS. And you may wonder, we have HTTPS set up on our site, so why can't people just go to that? Or we can turn off port 80 if we want, and there's some issues around that and how it may redirect properly for us. But how many times, and I do this myself, how many times when you go to view a website, maybe you're going to go, and I'll use my website as an example, but imagine if it was a bank or whatnot. But if you're going to go to DevelopSec.com, you just go type in DevelopSec.com. And while there's no login on this site, it is fully HTTPS compatible. And I do actually have HSTS set up on DevelopSec.com. So that way I could actually do some screenshots for this podcast and for a blog that corresponds with this podcast. Typically, I'll just go out and I'll say, okay, just go to www.developsec.com, right? And so often we leave off the protocol. Well, if I want you to go only to HTTPS, at this point, without HSTS, what I'm doing is I'm relying on you, the user, to type in HTTPS. Or if you don't, I'm going to make initial request over HTTP, because that's the default protocol. It's going to get to my server. I'm going to say, no, I want you to use HTTPS. I'm going to redirect you to the HTTPS port. And then you'll start actually using the site over HTTPS. Now imagine if that was a banking site or a site with a login. If I make the initial request over HTTP and that request goes across the wire from browser to server, now I run the issue that somebody in the middle could pick up that data. And if they're able to pick up and sniff that data, then they can then sniff the response where I'm saying, no, use HTTPS, and actually strip that HTTPS out. So imagine if that's a login form that I'm pulling down, that my login form is going to then say, yes, I submit to HTTPS, right? Maybe the whole page isn't HTTPS, but the form will say HTTPS for the action. Well, if I can man in the middle of that traffic, I can intercept it, I can manipulate it, then I can change that and say, no, I'm going to go ahead and allow this form to submit to HTTP or even to possibly a different site and collect those credentials. So what happens with the HTTP Strict Transport Security is that your site is sent down this header that tells the browser, hey, I don't want you to ever allow me to submit this over HTTP. Only over HTTPS. So I don't care if you put in just www.developsec.com, if you put in whack-developsec.com, http://whack-developsec.com, it's always going to first request be over HTTPS. The browser makes that change for you. And so you never get that initial request across the wire. So this is a great thing if your site is running HTTPS and only HTTPS to help make sure that people are accessing it the proper way. Now, there are some things to think about that we have to be aware of. First, by default, your site has to be able to send that response header down, and the response header is just a strict-transport-security response header, and there's a few flags you can set. One, which is required, is the max age flag. And again, this will be in the blog post I reference, so you can read a little bit more about it. The max age, which tells a number of seconds, how long the browser should remember this setting. You've got the include subdomains. So if I had other domains under developsec.com, maybe if I actually had like blog.developsec.com or wiki.developsec.com, if I sent it down on one, it would say, hey, browser, any domain, any subdomain of this, go ahead and use HTTPS only. So I can set up including the subdomains as well. And you can also do a preload list. And what the preload is, because remember, I have to visit the site before I get these headers. And for the browser to understand that I want to use HSTS. Waiting for that to happen before somebody gets to it, there's actually a site you can go to and you can register for it and get on the preload list. And some of the browsers now will check this list periodically and look to see, hey, is this site on there? And it'll load up. So now I don't even have to visit the site. The browser knows. The first time I visit that site, it'll automatically switch it over to HTTPS. Without getting on the preload, I have to access the site over HTTPS to initialize that. If I access it over HTTP, even if it returns that header, it's not going to see it as enabled because I'm not accessing the site over a secure channel. So it just ignores it at that point until you access it over a secure channel. Then it locks it in. The other thing to think about with HSTS is it doesn't work with self-signed certificates, right? That's one of the purposes, is we're trying to block man-in-the-middle type of attack, somebody trying to get a proxy in between you, so that I want to make sure it's a valid, trusted certificate from the server. So if you're a tester, maybe you're a penetration tester, maybe you're just a regular QA tester, and you run a proxy in between, if your site is set up properly and you get HSTS enabled and you go visit the site and the browser knows it's there, if you load that proxy in there and you get a self-signed cert, well, you're probably going to get an error message. And it looks typical to your typical certificate informational message with one exception. Well, I guess two exceptions. One, it'll actually say you have HTTP strict transport security enabled, so you can't do this. But the bigger thing is you're going to find that there's no way to add the exception. If you use Firefox, which I do when I do my testing, you always get with burp, you run through burp, and every time you hit the site, hey, this is an untrusted cert because it's the port swigger cert instead of the actual site cert. And it's not a trusted CA, so hey, there's a concern here. But there's an exception button, and I can say, yeah, I want to go ahead and add this as an exception. I'm fine with it. I trust the certificate. Let me roll through. With HSTS, we don't get that option. They take that button away. You can't say, yes, I want to do that. Now, if you're in that scenario as a tester, there is good news because we can actually save that cert out that was created by our proxy. So, for example, in burp, you can save out the burp cert that comes down through, and you can actually install that into Firefox and trust it as a cert. I wouldn't do that with a lot of different certs, but if you're a tester and you're doing that a lot with burp, it's fine to probably go in there and trust your cert. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to test the site. But if you go into Firefox or whatever browser you're using and trust the cert, then it should actually continue working, because it's not necessarily looking for the cert from that site. It's looking for a trusted cert coming down, and that's what it's enforcing. Now, one other thing that we need to think about is a lot of times we'll go in and we'll set this, a lot of examples online. The example you see, we set it to a year long for a period of time to watch and have the browser remember that I want to use HSTS. If you need to clear that, you want to tell the browser, hey, I don't want you to use HSTS anymore, you can send out a max age of 0. A max age of 0 is meant to tell the browser, hey, just go ahead and discard my domain as an HSTS domain. And it should stop supporting it and allow going to the HTTP. Rare, I think, that you would see people trying to take that away, unless for some reason you're doing some testing and site's not working well for you, so you decide, hey, we got to hold off. I do recommend, if you're going to implement this, test it. Make sure you're able to access the site as you should be. You can use some of the built-in web developer tools. For example, in Firefox, they have the web developer tools where you can view the request to response, and you can see the response headers, and you can see if it's enabling the HTTP strict transport security or not. There's actually a field in there to be able to see that you can say, oh yeah, okay, it is enabled, that's good, that's great. Also, a word of caution, if you're thinking about installing this and initiating it so it covers all your subdomains, if your test environments use your subdomains and you're not running those over HTTPS, or you have other subdomains that you run internally, maybe they're not available externally, but you run them internally, and they're not HTTPS, and you included the subdomains, or I believe with the preload list, it automatically just defaults to subdomains. You may come into some small issues there, or if you're using self-signed certs internally, there may be some troubleshooting you have to go through to make sure that everything's working properly. You don't want to lock yourself out of being able to test, but those are some things that could kind of go wrong as you're going through setting this up. I talked, it was months ago at least, maybe even longer than that, about, hey, is HTTP basically dying out and everybody's going to HTTPS? And there's been all kinds of debate over it. You've got the government saying, hey, we want all of our major sites on HTTPS only by the end of 2016. Other people are really pushing for HTTPS. And we're not just talking sites with passwords and sensitive information. We're talking every site, right? There's lots of reasons why people want to do it, whether it's privacy, whether it's some sort of security mechanism past the privacy part. But we are seeing a lot of companies push and start supporting HTTPS only. As a matter of fact, most of my domains do support HTTPS, and I'm actually in the process of implementing the HSTS across them because there's no need to actually support the HTTP portion. Even though there's nothing sensitive, we're not trying to hide anything on the site, but there's nothing really to protect. It just seems like it's a kind of the new good standard to follow. So that's HSTS. Sorry, I have it even wrong on the blog. I have to fix that. In a nutshell, kind of a quick overview. Definitely something to think about if you are an HTTPS only site. So I'll link to the blog on the show notes, but it's if you just go to https://www.developsec.com. There's a post in there, HTTP Strict Transport Security HSTS Overview. And right now it's the current one that's on top. And it's got a little bit more information, a lot of what we just talked about, but links out to some other information, which I didn't really talk about, but what type of browsers support this, right? I mean, IE 11 is the earliest IE version that supports HSTS. Safari on Mavericks, I believe, is the earliest that Safari supports HSTS. So we don't have full browser support for it yet. Well, we're getting there. If you're using some of the older versions of browsers, it may not support it, which really just means that you won't be forced to the HTTPS version, right? So again, if we're developers, we're not relying solely on this. We should have some other things in place because the browser may not support it that the users are using and try to access HTTP. So we want to make sure that we're still putting our cookies to setting the secure flag so it only allows a cookie to transmit over a secure channel, right? These type of protections we want to make sure we're still doing so we don't run into any issues like that. So I hope you enjoyed episode 30. I apologize for the delay. I had some job shuffles around here and things have slowed down a little bit, but I'm getting back into the swing of everything going on. I got lots of stuff that I want to talk about and share with everybody. So definitely look for some more good stuff to come out. Hopefully you think it's good stuff. And again, visit us out. We're at DevelopSec on Twitter and DevelopSec.com for the blog. And also there's a link there for the podcast. Lots of good information out there. So I look forward to talking to everybody again. I hope everybody's enjoying their year. And we will see you for episode 31.